Your home is supposed to be your ultimate safe haven. But what happens when an entire family simply vanishes from behind locked doors? Today we're covering the 10 most mysterious and disturbing family disappearances in history. These cases feature abandoned dinners, impossible logic gaps, and chilling clues that completely defy explanation. If you love deep dives into the unexplained, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and give hype points. Now, lock your doors and let's get into it. Picture Prince George, British Columbia, August of 1989. If you've never been up there, let me set the scene for you because the geography of this story is doing about half the work. Prince George is a hard town, a working town, cut into the middle of British Columbia where the forests start to stretch out into something that looks less like a country and more like an idea. Logging trucks rumbling through Main Street at 3 a.m., sawmills running around the clock, working men, working women, the smell of fresh-cut lumber and diesel, and just past the city limits, in every direction, millions and millions of acres of dense, dark, unforgiving wilderness. This is also where the so-called Highway of Tears begins. Highway 16, the notorious stretch of road that runs west out of Prince George and into a long history of unsolved disappearances and murders, most of them women, most of them indigenous, almost all of them swallowed by those endless trees. And on a hot August night in 1989, a young indigenous family of 4 walked out the front door of their small rental house on Strathcona Avenue, climbed into a stranger's pickup truck, and drove off into that wilderness. They have not been seen since. Not one of them. Not a backpack, not a scrap of clothing, not a tire track, not a single trace. This is the Jack family. And the more you look at the details of how they vanished, the worse it gets. So let's get into it. Ronald Jack, Ronnie, was 26 years old. Doreen, his wife, was also 26. They were both members of the Chislata Carrier Nation, an indigenous community in central British Columbia. They had 2 boys. Russell was 9. Russell was actually Ronnie's stepson, but Ronnie had raised him from the time he was tiny, and there was no daylight between them. And the youngest, Ryan, was 4 years old. The Jacks were not living an easy life in the summer of 1989. Ronnie had been a sawmill worker, a steady, decent job, but he'd hurt his back in an industrial injury and lost the work. The family had drifted to Prince George looking for opportunities. They were on government welfare. They were sinking into real debt. Doreen kept the house, looked after the boys, dreamed of better days. Ronnie was, by his mother's own words, desperate to work, desperate to provide, desperate to be the man he believed he was supposed to be. That word, desperate, is going to matter a lot in the next 10 minutes. On the evening of August 1st, 1989, Ronnie walked the 4 blocks from his rented house on Strathcona Avenue to a place called the First Leader Pub. Working-class spot, dim lighting, beer-soaked carpet, the kind of pub where loggers and truckers and mill workers blew off the day. And at some point that evening, Ronnie struck up a conversation with a stranger. The witnesses at the pub gave a very specific description of this man: Caucasian, late 30s, big, somewhere between 6 feet and 6'6", 200 to maybe 275 pounds of him, reddish-brown hair, full beard, wearing a ball cap, a red checkered work shirt, a blue nylon jacket, faded jeans. And here's the detail witnesses kept coming back to: distinctive work boots with leather fringes hanging down over the toes. You couldn't miss this guy. You really couldn't. The stranger told Ronnie he had a job for him, a logging camp out near Klukal's Lake, about 40 kilometers west of Prince George. Good money. They needed bodies. He could put Ronnie to work right now, but there was a catch. They had to leave tonight. Like, tonight. Right now. Ronnie was hesitant. He had a wife and 2 small boys. He couldn't just disappear into the woods for a couple of weeks without telling them, without making arrangements. So the stranger sweetened the deal. He told Ronnie that wasn't a problem. Bring the whole family. They had a daycare at the camp for the 4-year-old. Doreen could come too. There was even work for her. Stop. Right there. Let's just sit with the offer for 1 second. A stranger in a working-class pub at night offers a guy he has just met a job at a remote logging camp deep in the Canadian bush, demands he leave immediately, tells him to bring his wife, tells him to bring his 2 small children, including a 4-year-old, and assures him, hand on heart, that there is a fully staffed daycare at this remote bush logging operation. Has there ever been a logging camp on the planet with a daycare for toddlers? No. Of course there hasn't. This is not how the industry works. This is not how anything works. The whole pitch is, on its face, an obvious lie. But Ronnie didn't have the luxury of hearing it that way. Ronnie was broke. Ronnie was hurt. Ronnie was looking at another month of welfare checks while his boys went without. To Ronnie, drowning in that quiet daily humiliation, this stranger had just thrown him a rope. Of course he grabbed it, and that, I think, is the worst part of this whole story. The lie wasn't sophisticated. It didn't need to be. The lie just needed to be exactly the right shape to slip past a desperate man's guard. Ronnie and the stranger left the pub together. At 11:16 p.m., the two of them arrived back at the Strathcona Avenue house. Witnesses inside the house, Doreen, the kids, and Doreen's sister, Lorene, saw the stranger up close. They all noticed the same things: the size of him, the beard, the boots with the fringes. Ronnie called his brother in South Bank, trying to arrange for somebody to take the boys for a few days. That fell through. The stranger immediately had a solution: the daycare, the camp daycare. The camp had everything they needed. Bring the kids. At 1:21 a.m., and now we're into the early hours of August 2nd, Ronnie called his mother, Mabel, who lived out in Burns Lake. He told her he had a job. He told her the family was leaving immediately for a 10-day stint at a logging camp. He told her they'd be back before Russell started the new school year. And then, right before he hung up, Ronnie said something to his mother that has haunted her for the rest of her life. He said, "Mom, if I don't come back, come and look for me at the house." That is not the line of a man who fully trusted what was happening to him. That is the line of a man whose gut was screaming at him while his bank account drowned it out. Some part of Ronnie Jack knew. He just needed it badly enough that he went anyway. A short while later, relatives watched the family load a few small bags into the stranger's dark-colored 4x4 pickup truck. Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, Ryan, and the stranger. They climbed in. The truck pulled away from Strathcona Avenue, and it drove off into the August night. That was the last time anyone saw any of them, ever. Okay, let's actually pull this apart, because the more carefully you examine what supposedly happened, the more impossible it gets. First, the job itself. We've already covered the daycare detail, which is plainly a lie. But think about the timing, too. What legitimate employer in any industry anywhere on Earth recruits people at midnight in a pub and tells them they have to leave right now? Real jobs don't work that way. There is no legitimate version of this. The whole offer was a costume, a story crafted with care to extract a specific family unit from their home at a specific hour. Second, the logistics of that truck ride. Stop and visualize it. You've got the stranger driving. You've got Ronnie, a grown man. You've got Doreen, a grown woman. You've got a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old. You've got a few duffel bags. All of that in the cab of a 1989 pickup truck. That is cramped. That is shoulders touching. That is everybody in everybody's space. Now, at some point on that drive, Ronnie and Doreen had to have realized that they weren't going to a logging camp. Maybe it was when they turned off the main road. Maybe it was when the lights of Prince George disappeared behind them. Maybe it was earlier than that, when Ronnie looked into the stranger's eyes and saw something that didn't match the daycare story. So how did one man control 4 people in that cab, 2 of them adults, a grown sawmill worker with a wife and children to protect? There are really only 2 answers to that question, and both of them are dark. Either he had a gun pointed at one of the kids the whole time, and Ronnie went quietly because to resist was to lose his son in the front seat in front of him. Or, and this is the possibility a lot of investigators keep circling back to, the stranger was not alone. There was a second person in that vehicle, or following in another. One person doesn't pull off a 4-person abduction with this kind of cleanliness. 2 people might. Third, and this is where the case crosses over into the truly haunting, is what came after. Or rather, what didn't come after. In a normal disappearance case, even a tragic one, something surfaces eventually. A backpack in a ditch, A child's shoe on a logging road, a burned-out vehicle in the woods, a wallet, a tooth, something. Here? Nothing. 35-plus years of searching. Mabel Jack, Ronnie's mother, lived in tents for 2 months at a stretch, on her own, searching Lucas Lake. The family traveled to powwows across British Columbia and Alberta, having young relatives dance with photos while they called the missing names out into crowds. The RCMP eventually used ground-penetrating radar at a reserve south of Vanderhoof, following an anonymous tip in 1996. Nothing? Not one tire tread of that distinctive 4x4 pickup, not one fringed leather boot, not one duffel bag, not one trace of Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, or Ryan Jack. Erased. Erased in a way that feels less like a crime and more like a magic trick. And this is the institutional horror layered on top of the personal horror. In September of 1989, just weeks after the disappearance, the Prince George RCMP publicly reported that the family had been found safe. They hadn't been. The case was prematurely closed in the press. Momentum died, tips dried up, crucial early days were lost. By the time anyone realized the family was still missing, the trail was already cold. It's hard not to read that institutional shrug in the context of who the Jacks were. A young Indigenous family, on welfare, off the radar of anyone who mattered. The kind of missing persons case that, in 1989, British Columbia didn't get the front page. So this is where it sits, more than 3.5 decades later. A working-class father walked 4 blocks from his rented house to a pub in Prince George on a hot August night, looking for a break. He found one, or what looked like one. A big man in a fringed pair of boots, in a red checkered shirt, with a logging camp job and a daycare, and a story that didn't add up, but that didn't have to, because Ronnie Jack didn't have the luxury of asking too many questions. At 1:21 in the morning of August 2nd, he called his mother. He told her he loved her. He told her he'd be back in 10 days. He told her, just in case, where to start looking if he wasn't. Then he climbed into the cab of a stranger's truck with his wife and his 2 boys. The truck drove off into the dark. The headlights disappeared at the end of Strathcona Avenue. The engine faded into the August night, and the Canadian wilderness, which has swallowed so many people over the years, opened up just wide enough to swallow 4 more. A father went looking for a way to feed his family, and he led them straight into the passenger seat of a ghost. There's a stretch of land in southeastern Oklahoma called the Sans Bois Mountains. The name is French. It means without wood, which is almost funny because the place is choked with it. Dense, twisted oak, pine, heavy brush that swallows the light even at noon. Locals will tell you with a kind of quiet seriousness that you don't go up there alone. Not because of bears, not because of the cold, because of the people, meth cooks, squatters, men who built lives out of staying invisible. It is the kind of place where, if you scream, the trees just absorb the sound and give you nothing back. And on October 8th, 2009, a small family from Eufaula, Oklahoma, drove their pickup truck straight into the heart of it. They were never seen alive again. This is the story of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jameson. And I want to tell you up front, this isn't one of those mysteries that gets neatly solved at the end. This is one of those cases where the more you learn, the less sense it makes. So let's get into it. Bobby Jameson was 44. His wife Sherilyn was 40. And their little girl Madison was just 6 years old. They had a small dog named Maisie. By all accounts, they were a tight family. They had their problems, and we'll get to those because they matter, but they were close. They loved each other. They were planning a future together, and that future is what brought them to the Sans Bois. See, the Jamesons wanted out of the grid, out of the noise. They had recently come into some money. Bobby had received a substantial settlement, and they had a plan. They wanted to buy a 40-acre plot of land deep in the mountains, drop a storage container on it, and just live. Off-grid, self-sufficient, free. So on the morning of October 8th, they loaded up their white pickup truck and they headed for Red Oak, Oklahoma to look at a parcel of land. A simple day trip. Drive up, walk the property, drive home. That was the plan. Nobody ever saw them again. 8 days passed. And on October 16th, a local hunter, just walking a remote dirt logging road less than a mile from the property they'd gone to view, spotted something that didn't belong. A white pickup, locked, silent, sitting there like it had been parked by a ghost. He called it in. And when investigators got that truck open, this is where the whole thing stops making sense. Inside, they found everything, and I mean everything. Bobby and Sherilyn's wallets, their IDs, their cell phones, a GPS device, their winter coats. And remember, this is October in the mountains, where overnight temperatures were dropping to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They left their coats. But here's the part that stops you cold. Under the driver's seat in a plain bank envelope was $32,000 in cash. $32,000 just sitting there. And on the passenger floorboard, curled up and barely breathing, was their dog Maisie, locked inside the cab, severely malnourished, dehydrated, but somehow, against all odds, still alive. Now stop. Just stop for a second and think about that. If you are going for a quick hike to look at some land, you don't lock your dog in the truck and walk away. You take her with you. Or, at the very minimum, you crack a window. You don't seal her inside a metal box and abandon her. And if you're running away, if you're starting some new secret life, you don't leave $32,000 in cash behind. That's the money you need. That's the whole point of leaving. A man does not walk into the wilderness penniless on purpose. And if you're being robbed, tell me, what kind of criminal kidnaps a family of 3 and leaves $32,000 sitting under the seat? That's not a robbery. That's the opposite of a robbery. So already, before we've even gone any further, the basic facts of this scene are screaming at us that something is profoundly wrong. Then, investigators went back and pulled the security camera footage from outside the Jameson home in Eufaula, taken the morning they left. And what they saw on that tape genuinely unsettled the detectives working the case. It shows Bobby and Sherilyn loading the truck. But they're not loading it like normal people load a truck. They're walking back and forth, slowly, almost mechanically. They don't speak to each other. They pass each other multiple times and don't acknowledge one another. They stop. They stare into nothing. Then they pick up another bag and keep going. The investigators described it as trance-like, disjointed, effectless, like watching two people sleepwalk through their own driveway. At one point, Sherilyn is seen putting a brown briefcase into the truck, a briefcase that was never recovered. We don't know what was in it. We never will. Now, here's a detail that adds another layer to this. In the months leading up to their disappearance, the Jamesons had started telling people some pretty strange things. They told a local pastor they were seeing spirits in their house. Bobby reportedly said he was reading the Satanic Bible, not as a believer, but to try to fight off what he believed were demonic forces tormenting his family. Sherilyn had a documented history of severe bipolar disorder. Both of them had grown noticeably thin, gaunt. Friends were worried. So yeah, there's a psychological component here. There's stress, there's possible mental illness, there's something dark hanging over this family in the weeks before they vanish. But here's the thing. That doesn't explain the truck. None of that explains the truck. Let's actually walk through the theories, because every theory people throw at this case breaks down the second you push on it. Theory 1, they just got lost, wandered off into the woods, got disoriented, and died of exposure. It was 40 degrees. It happens. Okay, so why did they lock the truck? Think about that. If you're disoriented, you don't stop to lock your car. If you're injured, you don't stop to lock your car. The act of locking that vehicle is a deliberate, conscious choice, and the people who supposedly were so impaired they couldn't find their way back to their own truck somehow had enough presence of mind to seal it up like they were headed to the grocery store. And the coats. October, in the mountains, 40 degrees overnight. You don't go for a hike in conditions like that without a coat, unless you weren't planning to be outside long enough to need one, unless something interrupted whatever you were planning. And Maisie, that dog. You don't lock your beloved family pet in a vehicle and abandon her. People who love their dog, and by every account they love that dog, do not do that, not voluntarily. Theory 2, the drug deal. The Sans Bois is meth country. Maybe the Jamesons got tangled up in something they couldn't get out of. Maybe the $32,000 was for a buy that went wrong. But again, the money is still there. The money is still there. If a meth crew ambushed this family, the first thing they're taking is the cash. They don't kill 3 people, including a child, and then leave the entire payday sitting in the truck. It doesn't work that way. Criminals don't murder people for fun and then leave their wallets behind for the cops to find. Theory 3. The trance footage means they had some kind of psychotic break, some shared delusion. Bobby and Sherilyn went off the deep end and either killed themselves and their daughter or wandered into the woods to die. I'll grant you, that footage is unnerving. But people in the throes of a full psychotic break don't carefully lock their vehicle behind them. They don't pack winter coats they don't end up wearing. They don't bring $32,000. The act of preparation visible in that truck, the wallets, the IDs, the GPS, the coats, the cash, the briefcase, is the preparation of people who were planning something specific, something they expected to come back from. 4 years passed, 4 years of one of the largest search efforts in Oklahoma history. Over 300 volunteers, cadaver dogs, helicopters, nothing. And then, in November of 2013, 2 hunters scouting for a hunting spot found them. Skeletal remains, 3 of them, about 3 miles from where the truck had been abandoned. They were positively identified the following year as Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison. And here's the detail that won't let go of me. The bodies were found laying side by side, face down, together, now. If you are 3 people lost in the wilderness, dying of exposure over the course of hours or days, you don't end up like that. People dying of hypothermia get confused. They wander. They separate. They take their clothes off. There's an actual term for it, paradoxical undressing. They huddle, sure, but they don't lay themselves out in a neat little row, face down, and die in formation. That's not what exposure looks like. That looks placed. That looks arranged. But the bodies were too decomposed. After 4 years in the Oklahoma wilderness, exposed to weather and animals, there wasn't enough left for the medical examiner to determine a cause of death. No bullet holes in obvious places, no fractured skulls that survived, just bones. Cause of death, undetermined. Translation: we will never know what killed them. So here's what we're left with. A family of 3 drove up into the mountains on a clear October day to look at a piece of land they hoped to build a new life on. They locked their truck. They left $32,000 in cash inside it. They left their phones, their IDs, their coats, and their dog. They walked into the woods. And 4 years later, they were found 3 miles away, laid out side by side, face down on the forest floor. Were they murdered? Almost certainly. By who? We don't know. Were they on drugs? Maybe. Were they having a shared mental break? Maybe. Did they meet someone up on that mountain who they weren't supposed to meet? Maybe. The Sans Bois Mountains kept their secret. Whatever happened on that ridge, between the moment they locked the truck and the moment those bones came to rest in the dirt, has never been spoken aloud by anyone who was there. They drove into the mountains to buy a piece of land, to start over, to live free. And instead, they walked into the trees. And the trees just absorbed them. No clues, no footprints, no answers, just a locked truck, a starving dog, a pile of money nobody came back for, and 3 people lying face down side by side in the woods. Picture Fallbrook, California. February 2010. They call it the avocado capital of the world. And honestly, that tells you most of what you need to know. It's a quiet pocket of Southern California, north of San Diego, full of rolling hills and orchards and clean, sun-bleached suburban streets. The kind of neighborhood where kids ride bikes in the cul-de-sac, and the worst thing that happens on a Tuesday is somebody's sprinkler going off too early. It is the American dream rendered in stucco and palm trees. And on the night of February 4th, 2010, in a beautiful home in one of those quiet neighborhoods, a family of 4 sat down for the most ordinary evening you can imagine. A bowl of popcorn, the television on, 2 little boys in pajamas. And then, without a sound, without a scream, without a single drop of blood spilled on the carpet, they were erased. This is the McStay family. And I want to walk you through this one carefully, because even now, even after a man has been convicted and sentenced to death for what happened to them, the actual mechanics of how this crime was pulled off still don't make sense. So let's get into it. Joseph McStay was 40 years old. His wife Summer was 43. And they had two little boys, Gianni, who was 4, and Joseph Jr., who was 3. They had 2 dogs, both adored. They lived in a beautiful, recently renovated home in Fallbrook. Joseph ran a company called Earth-Inspired Products. He sold custom decorative indoor water fountains, the kind you'd see in the lobby of a fancy hotel or a corporate office. Business was booming. He had clients across the country. Summer was a licensed real estate agent. By every metric you can measure a young family by, the McStays were thriving. They had over $100,000 in liquid cash sitting in their bank accounts. They had no debts they couldn't handle, no enemies anyone knew of, no criminal entanglements. They were just a happy family on the upswing. So when, sometime in the second week of February, Joseph's brother Michael couldn't reach him on the phone for days, he started to worry. Really worry. Because that wasn't Joseph. Joseph answered his phone. Joseph called back. So Michael drove to the house. This is where the whole thing starts feeling wrong. Michael got to the home in Fallbrook. The doors were locked. He couldn't get a response. So he found an open back window, hoisted himself through, and stepped into what should have been a normal home, but wasn't. The house was empty. Not ransacked, not destroyed, not bloody, just empty. And paused. On the kitchen counter sitting out was a carton of raw eggs, just left there in February, warming on the counter for who knows how many days. Walk into the living room. On the futon, 2 child-sized bowls of popcorn, freshly popped, not eaten, just sitting there, waiting for the kids to come back from wherever they'd been called away to. The TV remote was where you'd expect it. The toys were on the floor. The dogs, those 2 beloved dogs, had been left outside in the yard. No food, no water, no one to let them in. Now, stop. Just think about that for a second. If you are a mother of 2 toddlers and you decide, for whatever reason, that tonight is the night to abandon your entire life and walk away forever, you do not pop popcorn for movie night 5 minutes before you leave. That's not how human beings work. You don't make a snack you're never going to eat. You don't crack open a carton of eggs and then leave them on the counter to rot. The popcorn is, in some ways, the most damning detail in this whole case. Because popcorn is an intention. Popcorn is a plan for the next 20 minutes. It is, we are sitting down together, right now, to watch something. It is the smallest possible commitment to staying put. And whatever happened to the McStays happened during that commitment. Now, 4 days after the family was last heard from, on February 8th, their white Isuzu Trooper turns up. And not in their driveway, not at a hotel, not at the airport. It turns up parked in a strip mall lot in San Isidro. That's the southernmost edge of San Diego, basically pressed up against the pedestrian crossing into Tijuana, Mexico. The car gets towed that night. And just like that, the investigation gets a story. San Diego County Sheriff's investigators looked at this and went, okay, the car is at the border. They must have walked across. Then, they pulled grainy, blurry surveillance footage from the border crossing itself, and they found something that looked sort of if you squinted, like a family of 4, a man holding a small child's hand, a woman holding another, walking south into Mexico. That was it. The case was, practically speaking, closed. The official theory became the McStays voluntarily walked away from their lives. Joseph was overwhelmed or running from something, or maybe wanted a fresh start. They walked into Mexico. End of story. For years, that was the story. But here's the thing. You don't leave $100,000 in the bank if you're fleeing. You don't. You drain the account first. You don't walk into Mexico as a young white American family of 4, 2 of you in diapers, on foot at night with no luggage, no plan, no Spanish, no car seats, no nothing. You don't leave your dogs in the yard to starve. You don't leave popcorn on the couch. And mostly, and I cannot stress this enough, who takes a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old on a casual stroll across an international border at night? Without strollers? Without bags? without any of the things small children require? The Mexico theory is, I'm sorry, ridiculous. It was ridiculous in 2010. The detectives just wanted a story that closed the file. And so for 3.5 years, while a killer walked free, the official story was that this family had gone on a spontaneous Mexican vacation. November 11th, 2013. Almost 4 years after they vanished, a guy on an off-road motorcycle is riding through the open Mojave Desert near Victorville, California. The Mojave is the polar opposite of Fallbrook. Wind-scoured, empty, scrubby, brown. It's a place where the earth swallows things. He spots something white in the dirt, bone white. He gets off the bike, he looks closer, and he calls the police. What investigators eventually unearthed from that patch of desert were 2 shallow graves, and in those graves were Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. The family tragically lost their lives to severe blunt force trauma, and buried with them, rusting in the dirt, was a 3-pound sledgehammer. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is the moment the Mexico theory dies a humiliating death. The McStays never crossed the border. They never made it out of California. They were dead, in the dirt, 2 hours north of their home, while the world believed they were starting a new life 2 hours south. Eventually, in 2014, police arrested Joseph's business partner, a man named Charles Chase Merritt. He'd been one of the last people to talk to Joseph. He had a serious gambling problem. After the family disappeared, Merritt wrote himself checks totaling over $21,000 from Joseph's business accounts and immediately blew the money at casinos. His DNA was found on the steering wheel of the abandoned Isuzu Trooper. In 2019, he was convicted of all 4 murders and sentenced to death. Case closed, right? Not so fast. Because here is the gigantic, unanswered, logic-shaped hole at the center of this whole thing. The prosecution's theory was that Merritt drove to the McStay home in Fallbrook, and inside that house, he tragically ended the lives of the entire family in that living room. Inside the house, now look. You cannot commit a violent act of that magnitude against 4 people and leave absolutely no trace. You just can't. Crime scene science doesn't work that way. A violent attack of that magnitude leaves extensive forensic evidence. It coats walls and soaks into carpet fibers. It hides in the grout between tiles. Modern forensics can find blood that's been bleached, painted over, scrubbed for years. In the Fallbrook home, investigators found 0 blood, 0, no spatter, no signs of struggle, no DNA, nothing. So how, exactly, does one man, Chase Merritt by himself, beat a grown man, a grown woman, and 2 small children to death in their living room, then clean the scene so perfectly that not a single technician with not a single piece of modern equipment ever found a trace? In a house where the popcorn was still in the bowls? And then, after performing this professional-grade biohazard cleanup, this same man supposedly loaded 4 bodies into the Isuzu Trooper, drove them 2 hours north into the Mojave Desert, buried them in 2 shallow graves, then drove the Trooper 2 hours south to the Mexican border, abandoned it in a strip mall lot to fake an escape, and got himself home, all in essentially one night by himself? That's not one logistical problem. That's a chain of logistical problems, each one stacked on top of the last, that an experienced contract killer would struggle with, let alone a guy whose main hobby was losing money at slot machines. I'm not saying Chase Merritt didn't do it. A jury looked at the evidence and decided that he did. The financial motive is real. The DNA on the steering wheel is real. The gambling and the embezzled checks are real. But the how of it? The clean house, the geographic split between the staged car and the buried bodies, the popcorn untouched on the futon while a one-man massacre supposedly happened in the same room. It doesn't fit together. It really doesn't. So this is where we are. A family was murdered, a man was convicted, and in legal terms the case is closed, but the case isn't actually solved, not in the way you and I would mean that word. Because we still don't know how it happened. We don't know how 4 people were killed in a quiet living room and left behind no trace. We don't know how their bodies ended up north and their car ended up south. We don't know who, if anyone, helped. We don't know what the McStays saw in the last moments before whatever entered their home entered it. What we do know is this. On a Thursday evening in February of 2010, in a quiet house in the avocado country of Southern California, a young family popped 2 bowls of popcorn. They sat down on the futon. The TV was probably on. The kids were probably arguing. The dogs were probably barking at something out the window. And then, somehow, with no scream loud enough for a neighbor to hear, and no struggle violent enough to spill onto the floor, and no blood left behind to tell the story, they were just gone. The popcorn stayed on the cushions for days, waiting for them to come back. It's Christmas Eve, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia, a coal mining town tucked into the folds of the Appalachian Mountains where the air smells like wood smoke and the wind cuts straight through whatever coat you're wearing. The war just ended a few months ago. Boys are coming home, Christmas trees are going up in front windows, and in a big 2-story house on a hill outside of town, an Italian immigrant family of 12 is celebrating the kind of loud, chaotic, joyful holiday that you only get when you have a lot of kids and a lot of love and not a lot of room. By dawn, half of those children would be gone. The house would be a pile of ash, and the United States would be left with one of the strangest, most disturbing missing persons mysteries it has ever produced. This is the Sodder children. And I want you to pay attention to this one, because almost everything you'll read about it sounds like a wild conspiracy until you start looking at the actual physics of what happened that night. So let's get into it. George Sodder, born Giorgio Sodu, came to America from Sardinia, Italy, as a boy. By 1945, he was a successful, self-made guy. Owned his own coal trucking company in Fayetteville, worked hard, built a life. He'd married Jenny, also an Italian immigrant, and together they had 10 children. The oldest, Joe, was off serving in the army. The other 9 were all home for Christmas. George was outspoken. That's important. In an Appalachian town full of Italian immigrants during World War II, George had been very, very loud about one particular subject. He hated Benito Mussolini. He hated the fascists. And he wasn't quiet about it. There were neighbors and locals, fellow Italian Americans who still had loyalty to the old country, who did not appreciate George Sodder's mouth. And in October of 1945, just 2 months before Christmas Eve, a strange man had shown up at George's house. He was, supposedly, a life insurance salesman. He looked over the property, and then, before he left, he turned to George and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to pay for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." George brushed it off. People say crazy things. It was the kind of country where threats sometimes flew around and meant nothing. But it didn't mean nothing. So it's Christmas Eve. The Sodder house is warm. The kids have new toys. The family's eldest daughter, Marion, had used her own money to buy them gifts. Jenny put the youngest children to bed around 10 p.m., then went to bed herself. George went to bed. And the older kids, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny Jr., 8, and Betty, 5, stayed up late playing in the front room. At about 12:30 a.m., the phone rings. Jenny wakes up and goes downstairs to answer it. On the other end of the line is a woman's voice she doesn't recognize. The voice asks for someone Jenny has never heard of. In the background, she hears clinking glasses and a strange, unfamiliar laugh. The woman hangs up. Jenny hangs up too. And as she's walking back upstairs, she notices something a little off. The lights on the ground floor are still on. The curtains are still open. The front door's unlocked. The older kids are supposed to lock up before bed, but they hadn't done it. Strange. But it's Christmas Eve. She lets it go. She walks back upstairs and gets into bed. At about 1 a.m., she hears a loud thud on the roof, followed by a rolling sound, like something landed on the shingles and then rolled off. She listens for a second. Nothing else happens. She goes back to sleep. 30 minutes later, she's awake again. This time it's the smell. Smoke. Heavy. She gets up. The house is on fire. George and Jenny scramble. They get themselves out. They get 4 of their 9 children out. The 4 who were sleeping on the lower floor, but the other 5, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty, are upstairs, trapped. and the flames are already coming up through the floor and walls. This is where the night turns from a tragedy into something much, much darker. George runs around to the side of the house to grab his big extension ladder. He's used it 100 times. He keeps it right against the side of the house. He gets to the spot. The ladder's gone. Just gone. Not knocked over, not buried under debris. Gone. Okay? New plan. George owns 2 coal trucks, big ones. He thinks, I'll back the truck up against the house, climb on top of the cab, and get up to the window that way. He runs to the first truck, turns the key. The engine doesn't even cough. He runs to the second truck. Same thing. Dead. These are working trucks. These are trucks he drove the day before, both of them refusing to start. At the same time, on the one night he needs them, he tries to get water. The rain barrel he keeps for emergencies is frozen solid. He tries to call the fire department. The phone is dead. Neighbors try to call too. Lines are out everywhere on that hill. And so George and Jenny stand there in their pajamas in the freezing cold West Virginia night, and they watch their house burn down around their 5 children. The whole structure collapses into ash in about 45 minutes. The fire department, which was only about 2 miles away, didn't arrive until 8 a.m. Their excuse, and this is real, was that the chief had to round up volunteers through a system that took forever to activate. When the ashes were finally cool enough to sift through, the fire chief did a search. And here is what he reported. No bodies, no bones, no teeth, nothing. 5 human beings, somewhere between the ages of 5 and 14, had supposedly been completely cremated by the fire. The official ruling: accidental electrical fire, all 5 children dead, bodies destroyed in the blaze. Case closed. Okay, let's actually look at this, because almost nothing in the official story holds up to even basic scrutiny. Start with the science, because this is the part that, for me, makes everything else in this case suddenly snap into focus. A wood frame house fire burns at somewhere around 1,200 to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit at its absolute hottest, and usually for a couple of hours before structural collapse cools things down. A crematory, a purpose-built industrial machine designed to incinerate a human body, burns at around 1,800 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it runs for 2 to 3 hours per body. And even after all of that, a crematory does not vaporize a person. It leaves behind distinct physical evidence that requires secondary industrial processes to fully break down to produce the ashes that get put into an urn. That is how cremation actually works. So what the official ruling is asking us to believe is that an ordinary house fire in West Virginia in December, burning for about 45 minutes before collapse, cremated 5 human bodies more completely than an industrial machine could in 3 hours, and produced not a single recognizable bone. That is not possible. That is a physical impossibility. Forensic experts later told the Sodders the same thing. There should have been remains, there should have been something. The fact that there was nothing did not mean the children were cremated. It meant the children were never in the house when it burned. Now, let's add up the other evidence. The ladder. Gone from its usual spot. Later, and this is wild, the ladder was found at the bottom of a 75-foot embankment well away from the house. Somebody had picked it up and thrown it into a ravine. Why? Why would the universe randomly move a ladder on the one night a man needed it to save his children and dump it down a hill? The trucks. Both of George's coal trucks, in perfect working order the day before, simultaneously refused to start. Later inspection of those trucks suggested they had been tampered with. The phone line. The fire department initially said the phone line had probably burned in the fire, but a phone repairman who later examined it said no. That line wasn't burned, it had been cut by somebody who scaled a 14-foot pole next to the house to do it. The thud on the roof. Remember that? The thud Jenny heard, followed by the rolling sound. Weeks after the fire, the Sodders' daughter Sylvia found something strange in the yard. A hard, dark green rubber object that looked, in her description, like a pineapple bomb. An incendiary device, something thrown, the Christmas lights. The fire chief said the cause was bad wiring, that an electrical short started the blaze. But witnesses said the Christmas lights on the porch were still glowing during the early stages of the fire. If the house's electrical main had shorted out badly enough to start a fire, those lights would have gone dark immediately. They didn't. So put it all together. The ladder is moved, the trucks are sabotaged, the phone line is cut, an incendiary device is thrown on the roof, and the fire is set. This is not an accident, this is an operation. So if the children didn't burn, and the physics says they couldn't have, then where are they? The Sodder parents, until their dying day, believed their 5 children were kidnapped. They believed somebody, in the chaos of the night, came up to the second floor, took the kids out of their beds, carried them off into the dark, and then set the house on fire to cover the trail. Whether the motive was mafia retaliation for George's anti-Mussolini speeches, or some kind of trafficking, or something else entirely, they didn't know. They just knew their kids weren't in those ashes. And here's the part that gives this whole story its real haunting weight. Years later, decades actually, strange things kept happening. People reported seeing children matching the descriptions of the missing Sodder kids at a tourist stop in West Virginia the morning after the fire, watching the news with a man who refused to let them speak. Reports came in from Florida, from Texas, from elsewhere. And then, in 1968, 23 years after the fire, a letter arrived at the Sodder home. No return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his late 20s who looked strikingly like an adult version of Louis Sodder. The photograph had a cryptic handwritten note on the back. Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, Elil boys, a 90132 or 35. The Sodders hired a private investigator to track down the source. The investigator went out, and then he disappeared. They never heard from him again. George Sodder put up a giant billboard on Route 16 just outside of Fayetteville. It had the faces of his 5 missing children on it. It offered a reward, first $5,000, then $10,000, for any information. That billboard stood for the rest of George's life. It stood for the rest of Jenny's life. They both died, never knowing what happened to their kids. Their surviving children kept the search alive. The last of those siblings, Sylvia, the one who found the rubber bomb in the yard, passed away in 2021. She went to her grave still believing her brothers and sisters had been taken. So this is where the case sits. On Christmas Eve, 1945, a family settled in for the warmest night of the year. The kids were playing with new toys. The parents were asleep. The tree was probably still lit. And in the space of one strange phone call, one thud on the roof, one missing ladder, 2 dead trucks, and one cut phone line, 5 children vanished into the cold West Virginia night. The official story says they burned. The science says they couldn't have, which leaves us with the only other possibility. Somebody walked up that hill on Christmas Eve, took 5 children out of their beds, and set a fire to make the world stop looking for them. And for almost 80 years now, the world has been looking and not finding. Just a billboard on a country road, 5 young faces, and a question that won't quite die. It's September 1st, 1999, Saint-Malo on the north coast of Brittany, France. If you've never been, picture a walled medieval city perched right on the edge of the English Channel, old granite ramparts, narrow cobbled streets, the smell of salt and crepes, and in the harbor below the walls, a forest of sailboat masts gently rocking. The kind of postcard-perfect French coastal town where wealthy professionals go on holiday with their families. The weather that day was by all accounts perfect for sailing. Calm seas, steady wind, blue, blue, blue. And on a chartered 30-foot sailboat called the Nick, a respected provincial doctor, well-dressed, polite, with 2 small, sleepy children in tow, pushed off from Pontoon E and pointed the bow out into the open channel. His wife was not with him. His wife was already dead. This is the case of the Goddard family. 26 years on, French investigators still don't fully agree on what happened in the days after that boat slipped its mooring. The ocean, slowly, over the course of 7 years, gave parts of the story back. And the parts it gave back only made the mystery worse. So let's get into it. Dr. Yves Goddard was 44 years old, by trade a general practitioner. He ran a small practice in Caen, in Normandy, where he also did acupuncture on the side. Locally, opinions on Yves were a little divided. His patients liked him. He was attentive. He was a doting, openly affectionate father. Neighbors describe a man who genuinely adored his children. But he was also viewed as eccentric. He was deeply involved in a militant French tax protest movement called the CDCA, and he was, the records would later show, drowning. Quietly. About 300,000 euros in unpaid medical fees and back taxes had piled up around him. The man in the white coat was being chewed alive from underneath by paperwork. His wife, Marie-France, was also 44. His second wife. They had 2 children together. Camille was 6, a bright little girl, the apple of her father's eye, and Marius was 4. Both kids adored their dad. From the outside, the Godards were prosperous. A doctor's family in Normandy, nice house in the rural village of Juvigny-sur-Seulles. Polite, well-dressed, well-behaved kids, the picture of provincial French success. The picture, of course, was a picture. On August 30th, 1999, Yves Godard went to work at his calm practice and saw a normal day's worth of patients. By every account, he was professional. Calm, just a doctor doing his rounds. Nobody noticed anything off. On August 31st, he abruptly canceled all his upcoming appointments, did some paperwork, took the children fishing in a little spot near Planquery. This is the last day, as far as anybody can establish, that Marie-France Godard was alive. The next morning, September 1st, Yves drove with his 2 children to Saint-Malo, where he had chartered a sailboat called the Nick, a Jeannot Sun Odyssey 30. He told the boat's owner he and the kids were going on a short coastal cruise. He bought some cleaning supplies, but, strangely, left them behind in his Volkswagen van at the port. He boarded the boat with Camille and Marius. He cast off. For the next few days, the Nick drifted in and out of public view in a kind of dreamy haze. On September 2nd, French customs officers conducting a routine check off Cap Fréhel boarded the boat. Yves was at the helm. One of the kids was sleeping below. Nothing about the scene rang an alarm bell, though one officer noted afterward that something in Godard's manner had given him a vague sense of unease. They let him go. On September 3rd or 4th, the Nick was seen near the Bay of Braillac. A waffle vendor on the beach later said she sold waffles to Yves and the 2 children that day. By the look of her, business as usual. Father and kids, sunshine, waffles, nothing wrong. Walkers later spotted the Nick near a place called Pointe de Minard. The boat looked empty, drifting. Then on September 5th, the Nick's inflatable dinghy was found, alone, floating 30 miles off the Ile de Batz. Inside was Yves's jacket and his checkbook. But no Yves, no Camille, no Marius. And in the days that followed, no sailboat. The Nick itself was simply gone. Meanwhile, back in Juvigny-sur-Seulles, the family's empty home was about to give up its secret. When police finally entered the Godard residence in early September, the house looked, at a glance, almost normal. Tidy, cared for, a respectable doctor's family home. Then they pulled out the luminol. For anyone who doesn't know, luminol is the spray that makes cleaned-up blood glow blue under UV light. It can detect blood that's been wiped, scrubbed, even bleached, sometimes years after the fact. When they sprayed the Godard house, the rooms lit up. The bedroom, the living room, the bathroom. Marie-France Godard's blood was everywhere. Vast quantities of it, wiped down, scrubbed, bleached. But still there, etched into the wood and tile, glowing under the lamps. Then they went to the Volkswagen van Yves had left at the harbor in Saint-Malo. Same story, massive amounts of blood. And, in the van, this part is genuinely sinister, vials of morphine. The kind of medical-grade morphine a country doctor would have easy access to. So now we have a picture. A doctor, drowning in debt, kills his wife at home in Juvigny, probably sedates and murders her, spends hours, possibly the better part of a day, meticulously bleaching the crime scene, drives her body somewhere, drives himself, with his 2 children who somehow didn't see, to Saint-Malo, rents a boat, sails out into the channel, and then it gets weird. Because the Nick didn't just sink in a clean way and disappear, the English Channel didn't take her in one bite. Over the following years, and I want you to really sit with this, the ocean handed pieces of this family back, one at a time, in ways that did not and do not make sense. September 1999, almost immediately after the disappearance, the Nick's emergency life raft washed up on a beach in Lyme Bay on the English coast of Dorset, far across the channel. And here is the detail that gets investigators' attention. The red canvas canopy of the life raft had been deliberately sliced off, cut with a blade by a person. That dinghy that turned up off the Ile de Batz, the one with Eve's jacket and checkbook in it, the inflation device, the cord you pulled to deploy it in an emergency, had been manually detached, removed by hand, not popped open in a panic, removed. In June of 2000, almost a year later, a shell harvester working in Saint-Brieuc Bay dredged up something small. Marine authorities dredged up partial remains. Forensic dental analysis matched them to little Camille Godard. Just a fragment of a 6-year-old, no other trace with it. Then, in early 2001, and this is the detail that turned the whole case from a tragic family annihilation at sea into something genuinely uncanny. Multiple credit cards belonging to Yves Godard were found on a single beach in the Ebihans archipelago, found one after another on the same beach, and when marine forensics examined those credit cards, they came to a conclusion that broke the whole timeline. Those cards had not been submerged in seawater since 1999. The plastic showed almost no degradation. They had been dropped onto that beach in 2001, a year and a half after Yves Godard supposedly died at sea by somebody. And finally, in 2006, divers recovered bones from the seabed in a deep underwater trench called Hurd's Deep in the English Channel. A femur and a tibia, Yves Godard's leg. The Nick itself? Never found. Marie-France? Never found. 4-year-old Marius? Never found. Now, let's stop and pull this apart because there are at least 4 things in this story that simply cannot all be true at the same time. First, the kids. If you're Yves Godard and you have just murdered your wife in a fit of debt-driven panic and you're trying to escape, why on earth do you take the children? A 6-year-old and a 4-year-old are not assets in an escape. They're noise. They're witnesses. They're complications at every customs check, every fuel stop, every conversation with a dockmaster. The only reason you take them is if your plan was never to escape at all. The only reason you take them is if they are part of what's being erased. Second, where is Marie-France's body? This is a man who, after killing her, had enough time and presence of mind to bleach an entire house, multiple rooms, walls, floors. He drove a van, he chartered a boat, he sailed for days, and in all that time, somewhere along the way, he disposed of his wife's body so completely that 26 years of investigation have not produced one bone, one tooth, one scrap of her. That is not panic. That is meticulous, calculating, planned disposal by a person with medical training. Third, and this is the strangest thread of the whole case, the breadcrumbs. The life raft canopy sliced off with a knife, the dinghy inflation device manually detached, the credit cards dropped onto a beach a year and a half after the family supposedly died. That last one. Stop and read it again. The credit cards were on a French beach in 2001. Forensics could prove they had not been in seawater for 2 years. They were placed there by somebody in 2001. If Yves Godard was dead at the bottom of the channel in September 1999, and the leg bones suggest he was, then somebody else was littering his ID across French beaches 18 months after the fact. Somebody who knew the route, somebody who wanted authorities to keep finding the wreckage of this story in convenient little pieces. Either Yves Godard had an accomplice, somebody on land who continued the misdirection after his death, or somebody else entirely was involved in this from the beginning. Maybe somebody who had a reason to want a French doctor with 300,000 euros in debts and a militant tax protest affiliation to stay missing. Fourth, how does a 30-foot sailboat completely vanish? If the Nick had sunk in bad weather, there would have been wreckage, cushions, fiberglass, sails, the mast, something. Yachts don't just disappear, but the Nick did. To this day, the boat itself has never been found. which suggests that whatever happened to it was not accidental. It was sunk, probably in deep water, probably on purpose, by someone who knew exactly where the deep, cold parts of the channel hide their secrets. So this is what we have. A respectable provincial doctor, a wife murdered and meticulously erased from her own house, two small children who climbed aboard a sailboat one perfect blue morning and never came home, a trail of debris across the English Channel that doesn't quite obey the laws of currents or time, and, somewhere in the deepest trench between France and England, the bones of a man, and only of a man, who was once a father. The official line is that Yves Godard, crippled by his debts, killed his wife at home, took his beloved children on one last sail, and at some unknown point in the middle of the night out there, deliberately sank the Nick with the three of them aboard, a family annihilation finished by sea. It's possible. The fatherly love that everyone described in this telling is the same fatherly love that decided his children could not survive him. But the credit cards on the beach in 2001 say someone else was still in the story. The sliced raft canopy and the detached inflation device say staging, not panic. And the missing wife, and the missing boat, and the missing little Marius say that the ocean has not given everything back. Not yet. A doctor sailed off the edge of his own life with his children one September morning in 1999. The channel took them. And every couple of years, for a long time afterward, it casually placed one more piece of them back on a French beach, just to remind everyone that the story was still going on. Without them. Most of the cases on this channel are about people who vanish, disappear, stop showing up on the surveillance cameras and the credit card statements and the cell tower pings, and then we spend the next 60 years arguing about what happened to them. This one is different. This case is about a perfectly happy, perfectly wealthy, perfectly normal family of 5, a hard-working Australian family with no debts, no enemies, no addictions, no diagnoses, no warning signs of any kind, who one August morning in 2016 suddenly decided that an invisible force was hunting them and that the only way to survive was to flee. Without their phones, without their wallets, without their passports, without their credit cards, and within 48 hours they had each fractured off in 5 different directions across the Australian outback, each one of them in a different state of psychological collapse. One of them was discovered catatonic in the back of a stranger's truck. Another was wandering the streets of a country town, begging strangers for help against pursuers nobody could see. What happened to the Trump family in August 2016 is one of the strangest things I have ever read about. And I want to be very upfront with you. We still don't really know what they thought was chasing them. So let's get into it. Sylvan, Victoria. About an hour east of Melbourne, rolling green hills, vineyards, orchards, that lush kind of agricultural Australia that you don't see on the postcards because it's busy actually working for a living. And on a beautiful patch of that countryside, the Tromp family ran a thriving red currant farm. Mark Tromp was 51. His wife, Jacoba, was 53. They were not just farmers, by the way. They also owned a profitable earth-moving business on the side. They were, by any measure you want to apply, rich, successful, industrious, Australian small business royalty. They had 3 adult children. Rihanna, the oldest, was 29. Mitchell was 25. Ella, the youngest, was 22. All 3 of them still lived with their parents at the family farmhouse, working the business together, the way some farming families do. And here's the part I cannot stress hard enough. There were no problems, there was no debt, there were no enemies, there was no history of mental illness on either side of the family. Nobody in this household drank too much, used drugs, belonged to a cult, watched too much conspiracy YouTube, or fought with the neighbors. They were, by the unanimous account of everyone who knew them, the absolute textbook definition of a stable, hard-working, harmonious Australian rural family. Which is why what happened in late August of 2016 is so genuinely, deeply strange. In the days leading up to August 29th, something began to happen inside the Tromp farmhouse. It started, by all accounts, with Mark, the patriarch. He became convinced that somebody was coming for them. Some entity, some person, some force. Investigators have never been able to nail down exactly who or what Mark believed the threat was, but he became convinced. And then, and this is the part the psychiatrists will spend the rest of their careers trying to explain, he convinced everyone else. Jacoba bought it first, then Rihanna, then Ella, and then, at least partially, Mitchell. All 5 members of the family over the course of a few days came to share the same conviction. They were being hunted. They had to run. They had to run now. So on the morning of August 29, 2016, they did. They piled into Ella's silver Peugeot SUV, 5 adults in one vehicle, and they bolted from the farm. Now I want you to listen carefully to what they left behind, because this is the first big logic gap. They left the doors of the house unlocked. They left the other family vehicles in the driveway with the keys still in the ignitions. They left their passports stacked neatly on the counter. They left their credit cards. They left their bank cards. They left every mobile phone in the house. Stop. Think about that for a second. If you genuinely believe someone is coming to kill you and steal everything you own, what do you take? You take money. You take your ID. You take a way to communicate with the outside world. You take the tools of survival. But the Trumps did the exact opposite. They deliberately stripped themselves of every modern convenience that could keep them alive. Money, identification, communications, because they had become convinced these things themselves were the trackers. The phone could be traced, the credit cards could be traced, the passports could be flagged. To them, every modern piece of plastic in their pockets was a homing beacon for whoever was hunting them. So they cut all of it off, and they drove north into New South Wales, with nothing in their pockets but the clothes they were wearing. That is not a flight from an assassin. That is a flight from a signal. About 30 kilometers into the drive, near Warburton, the family stopped. Mitchell, the 25-year-old son, had secretly slipped his own phone into his pocket before they left. He hadn't been able to bring himself to leave it behind. He kept it hidden. The family figured it out. His parents demanded that he get rid of the phone. They were convinced it was bugged, that the hunters were listening through it, that keeping it would lead them all to their deaths. And so, Mitchell, with his parents standing right there, threw his phone out the window of the moving car, somewhere in the bush near Warburton. That was the moment, Mitchell later said, that he realized something was deeply, deeply wrong. Not with the imaginary pursuers, with his own family. He kept going along with it for a while, telling himself he had to stay close to make sure nobody got hurt. But the seed of doubt was in. They drove through the night, 800 kilometers all the way to Bathurst, New South Wales. The next morning, August 30th, at about 7 a.m., Mitchell quietly walked out on the rest of his family in Bathurst. He found a train station. He started the long, slow series of train rides back home to Melbourne. The remaining 4, Mark, Jacoba, Rihanna, Ella, kept going. They drove to the Jenolan Caves in the Blue Mountains. And this is where the family started coming apart in real time. Rihanna and Ella, the daughters, became convinced their parents were now the danger. Whatever was wrong with their parents, whatever was happening inside Mark and Jacoba's heads, the daughters could see it from the outside. The pursuers were imaginary. The instability of their parents was not. So the daughters did something dramatic. They stole a car in the Jenolan Caves area, and they ran from their own parents. They drove south toward Goulburn. At a petrol station in Goulburn, the 2 sisters split up. Ella drove the stolen car all the way back to the family farm in Sylvan, by herself on autopilot, possibly because she remembered she needed to feed her horses. She arrived at the farm that night to find the police already there searching. Rihanna didn't make it. Sometime that day, Rihanna climbed into the back of a random stranger's parked utility truck, a guy named Keith Whitaker, and just lay down in the tray. Whitaker drove off, didn't know she was back there. At some point on the drive, he felt a kick against the back of his seat. He pulled over, looked in the back, and there was Rihanna Trump, a 29-year-old woman, lying there, catatonic, unable to remember her own name, unable to say where she was, unable to explain how she got there. She was hospitalized for emergency psychiatric care. Meanwhile, Mark and Jacoba, the parents, kept driving. Eventually, they too separated, splitting up violently somewhere around Wangaratta back in Victoria. On September 1st, Jacoba was found wandering the streets of Yass, 350 kilometers from where she'd last been with Mark. agitated, paranoid, begging strangers for help against imaginary pursuers, hospitalized. And on September 3rd, 6 days after this whole thing started, Mark Tromp was found walking along a country road near Wangaratta Airport. He was assessed, released into the care of his brother, and on the way out, he flipped off the news cameras. He later apologized for the gesture, for what it's worth. 5 Tromps. 5 different stories, 5 different breakdowns, all of them landing in 5 different places. So let's actually pull this apart because every layer of it is stranger than the last. First, the pursuers. Police immediately took the threat seriously. They went through the farm, they went through the financial records, they went through Mark's business deals, they went through every neighbor, every employee, every supplier, every customer, every relative. They looked for stalkers, debts, mafia, enemies, threats. There was nothing. The Tromps were not in debt. They were owed no money. They had no enemies anyone knew about. There were no threatening phone calls, no menacing letters, no surveillance, no break-ins, no anything. The hunters that the Tromp family was running from did not exist, not in any physical, verifiable sense. The pesticide theory came up early. Could chemicals on the farm have caused mass hallucination? It was investigated, ruled out. Toxicology came back clean. So we are left with the only remaining explanation, which is, frankly, the most chilling one. Psychiatrists who looked at this case used a phrase you might have heard before, folie à deux, literally madness of two. It's a rare, well-documented psychiatric phenomenon where one person experiencing a delusion transmits that delusion to someone in close emotional proximity to them. It happens between spouses sometimes, between siblings, almost always between 2 people who are extremely isolated together. 2. The Tromps were 5. What apparently happened in Sylvan, Victoria, in August of 2016 was a folie à famille, madness of an entire family. Mark, under accumulating mundane life stress, had what's called a brief reactive psychosis, a short, sharp mental break. And because the family was so closely knit, so insular, so reliant on each other, so much in each other's pockets every day, his delusion didn't stay inside his own head. It infected Jacoba. Then it infected the daughters. And finally, partially, it infected Mitchell. I want to underline how rare this is. The medical literature on shared psychotic disorder is thin precisely because the conditions required to produce it almost never line up. You need an extremely dominant personality with the delusion. You need extremely close, isolated relationships, and you need the suggestible parties to have no external grounding to anchor them back to reality. The Tromps, working together on a farm 7 days a week, living together as 5 adults under one roof, had accidentally built the perfect petri dish for it. And here is the final, most haunting logic gap of all. They ran together because they thought togetherness was survival. They thought the only way to outlast the hunters was as a unit. The whole point of fleeing was not to be separated, but within 48 hours of leaving the farm, they had become so terrified of each other that they scattered in 5 different directions across 2 Australian states. That tells you everything you need to know about what was actually chasing them. It wasn't outside the car. It was in the car. The Tromps survived. Every one of them. After psychiatric care, after weeks and months of recovery, they eventually reunited back at the farm in Sylvan. Mark publicly apologized for the chaos. The family declined most interview requests. They went back to their berries and their earth-moving business and the quiet of the Victorian countryside. And here's the part that has stayed with me, longer than any of the rest. To this day, none of them has ever publicly explained exactly what they believed was hunting them. Not in detail, not on the record. Whatever Mark thought he saw, whatever Jacoba came to believe, whatever vision was so vivid and so terrible that 3 healthy adult children grabbed their keys and ran, they have kept it inside the family. Which, honestly, might be the right call. Because shared delusion, the psychiatrists say, partly depends on the delusion being spoken aloud, repeated, reinforced. The Tromps stopped saying it, and the monster, whatever it was, stopped existing. A perfectly happy, perfectly normal family woke up one morning, looked out at their red currant fields, decided that the world had become a trap, and ran for their lives, straight out of reality and back, 28 years and 100,000 acres, into the strangest week the Australian outback has ever seen. Sometimes the missing person isn't the person, sometimes it's the mind. Imagine Labor Day weekend, 1974. The Siskiyou Mountains in southern Oregon. Picture it for a second, because the atmosphere of this case is everything. Tall evergreens, cold, clear water rushing over smooth rocks, sunlight cutting through the trees in those long, golden late summer angles, the smell of campfire smoke and pine needles, a creek called Carberry, a place so picturesque, so postcard perfect, that families have been driving up there for generations to spend their last lazy weekend of the summer before the kids go back to school. It was that kind of place, that kind of weekend. And it was the last weekend of the Cowden family's life. This is one of those stories where the location is so peaceful, so familiar, so utterly normal, that what happened there feels almost obscene. Because in broad daylight, on a sunny holiday morning, a young family of 4 was plucked out of their campsite and erased. And to this day, more than 50 years later, nobody can quite explain how it was done. So let's get into it. Richard Cowden was 28 years old. Big guy, strong, outdoorsman, worked hard, loved his family. His wife Belinda was 22, a young mom, full of energy, devoted to her 2 kids. Their son David was 5 years old, and their baby girl, Melissa, was just 5 months old. 5 months. She was still nursing. She was the kind of baby that doesn't go anywhere without her diaper bag. They lived in White City, Oregon, not far from the mountains. Belinda's mother lived just a mile or so from the Carberry Creek campground, which is part of why this trip was such an easy, casual decision. They drove up on August 30th in Richard's 1956 Ford pickup, set up camp at a little spot along the creek, and they planned to spend the long weekend swimming, eating hot dogs, and just being a family. The plan was to wrap up the trip on Sunday evening with a dinner at Belinda's mother's house. That dinner never happened. The morning of September 1st, 1974, started exactly the way you'd want a camping morning to start. Around 9 a.m., Richard walked with little David down to the Copper General store, a tiny little outpost not far from the campground, and he bought a half-gallon of milk. The store owner saw them, father and son, walking out together, heading back toward camp. That is the last verified sighting of any member of the Cowden family alive. By 5 o'clock that evening, when Belinda didn't show up at her mother's house for dinner, the mother got worried. She drove up to the campground herself to see what was holding them up. And what she found at that campsite is, to this day, one of the most chilling scenes in American true crime. Picture it. She pulls up. The pickup truck is parked right where it should be. The tent is up. The camp is intact. But it is silent. Not a person in sight. Not a sound. On the picnic table, Belinda's purse is sitting open. Her keys are right there next to it. The diaper bag is open, mid-use. And the half-gallon of milk Richard had bought that morning, it's sitting out on the table, half empty, going warm in the September sun. On the ground, a plastic dish pan filled with cold water. Like someone had started doing the dishes and then just stopped. A responding state trooper later said the scene was, quote, spooky. That was his word. A grown lawman used to bad scenes, and the word he picked was spooky. Because everything was where it should be. Everything was set up for the family to come back to it in 5 minutes. They just never came back. Now, stop. Let's actually look at what's in front of us. You don't leave milk sitting out in the sun if you're going on a long hike. You put it in the cooler. That is muscle memory for any parent. You especially don't leave it out if you've got a 5-month-old baby who depends on consistent food handling. You don't leave your purse and your keys on a picnic table in the woods. You take your keys. Always. People take their keys. And you don't leave a diaper bag open mid-use. That bag goes wherever the baby goes. That's the law of having an infant. Whatever happened to the Cowdens didn't happen at the end of the day. It happened in the middle of an action, mid-dishwashing, mid-milk pour, mid-diaper change probably. Something walked into that campsite in broad daylight and made the entire family stop what they were doing and leave with it. And here is the other detail that floored investigators when they cataloged the scene. Richard Cowden's wallet was lying in the dirt. His wristwatch, an expensive one for the era, was sitting right there too. The wallet still had $21 in it. So this wasn't a robbery. A robber doesn't leave the wallet. A robber doesn't leave the watch. Whoever took the Cowdens did not want their money. They wanted them. The only things missing from the entire campsite, besides the family themselves, were their swimsuits. That was the clue everyone clung to. It looked like they had walked down to the creek for a swim and never made it back. A massive search kicked off. State troopers, volunteers from all over the region, search dogs, helicopters scanning the canopy, hundreds of people walking grid patterns through the Siskiyou forests for weeks. They found absolutely nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no blood trail, no campsite disturbance leading off into the woods, no tire tracks from a getaway vehicle. The Cowdens just evaporated until they didn't. 7 months later, in April of 1975, two gold prospectors were hiking through that same patch of forest, and they came across a small, rocky cave. They looked inside, and they found the entire family. Richard had been tied to a tree just outside the cave. The bodies of Belinda, little David, and baby Melissa were inside. Belinda and David had both been victims of a fatal attack. 5-month-old Melissa also tragically lost her life in the cave. Richard's cause of death couldn't be fully determined because of the condition of the remains, but it was clearly a homicide. Now, here is the detail that makes this whole case unravel. That cave was approximately 100 feet from the campsite. 100 feet. That's it. Belinda's mother walked right past that cave when she came up to investigate. The state troopers walked past it. Hundreds of search volunteers walked past it. Cadaver dogs were brought into that exact area. And 4 bodies sat undiscovered, 100 feet uphill from a picnic table where a half-gallon of milk had gone warm in the sun. Let's slow down and pull this apart, because nothing about this scene makes sense if you actually think about it for 30 seconds. First, the missing swimsuits. The natural theory has always been the family went down to the creek to swim and they got ambushed there. Okay, but when investigators recovered the bodies, the family wasn't in swimsuits. They were dressed in regular clothes. So what happened? Did they change back? They had time to towel off and put their normal clothes back on, but they didn't have time to put the milk away? Or did the killer take the swimsuits as some kind of souvenir, some kind of trophy? Either way, those are not the actions of a casual, opportunistic crime. That is somebody who lingered, somebody who handled the scene, somebody who had time. Second, and this is the big one, how does one person do this? Richard Cowden was 28 years old, outdoorsman, strong. He had a wife and 2 children right there, including a baby. Every primal instinct a man has is going to fire the second something threatens his family. So how does an attacker walk into that camp in daylight on a holiday weekend when other campers and hikers are presumably nearby and round up 4 people, including a 5-year-old who would scream and a 5-month-old who would cry, and march them 100 feet up a hillside into a cave? Without anyone hearing anything. Without Richard fighting back hard enough to leave a single sign of struggle at the campsite. Without anybody noticing that something was deeply, terribly wrong. It's almost impossible. Unless there was more than one attacker, or unless there was an immediate, undeniable threat to his infant daughter. Because if you're Richard Cowden and somebody has your child in their sights, you go quietly. You do what they say. You walk up the hill. You hope. You comply. Because to fight back is to lose your child in front of you. That, I think, is the only version of this story that actually works mechanically. And it's a horrifying one. Third, the search. Hundreds of people, trained search dogs, aircraft, and 4 human bodies just over a football field's distance from the picnic table went undiscovered for 7 months. How? One possibility is just the brutal terrain. That cave was apparently small, well hidden, easy to walk past. But there's another possibility that's much darker. A volunteer searcher from Grants Pass, Oregon, later came forward and swore on his memory that he had personally checked that exact cave during the original 1974 search, and he insisted, flatly, that the cave was empty when he looked in it. If he was right, and that's a big if, that means the killer didn't put the bodies in the cave right away. The killer kept them somewhere else. And then, sometime after the search wound down and the world stopped looking, the killer brought the Cowdens back, placed them in that cave, like he was finishing some kind of project, like he was tucking them in. I don't know which is more disturbing, the idea that the search just missed them, or the idea that a killer was patient enough and confident enough to come back later and stage the final scene. For years, suspicion fell on a paroled killer named Dwayne Lee Little. At 16, he had murdered a teenage girl. He was paroled in May of 1974, just 3 months before the Cowdens vanished. He was placed in the Copper area that exact Labor Day weekend. His family signed a guest book at a nearby cabin the day after the disappearance. He was later seen with a .22 caliber handgun around Christmas of 1974, the exact caliber used to murder Belinda and David. An inmate later claimed Little confessed to him. Little was convicted of other horrific violent crimes throughout his life, but he was never formally charged for the Cowden murders. The circumstantial case was strong, the hard evidence was not, and eventually, the chance to bring him to trial just passed. So that's where it stands. A young family on a sunny Labor Day morning. A father and son walking back from the store with a jug of milk. A young mother probably washing breakfast dishes by the creek. A baby in a diaper bag. A campsite waiting for an afternoon of swimming and a dinner at Grandma's house. And then, something. Something that walked out of the Oregon woods in broad daylight. Something that did its work quietly enough that the milk never made it back to the cooler, and the dishpan never got emptied, and the keys never made it off the picnic table. The Cowdens were found 100 feet uphill. 100 feet? Practically within shouting distance of where Belinda's purse still sat open on the bench. Whoever did this stood there, in that quiet patch of forest, with a young family in front of him, and made his choice. And then he walked back out of those trees, and nobody saw him go. A peaceful campsite, a half-empty carton of milk going warm in the sun, and a young family just 100 feet away, already gone. Picture Nantes, France, April 2011. The west of France, a city of stone and old money, and quiet, narrow streets. Specifically picture a neighborhood in the western suburbs, Boulevard Robert Schumann, a row of bourgeois townhouses with closed shutters and pristine little gardens, where the bakeries open early and the neighbors say bonjour, and the families inside have been Catholic for about 1,000 years. This is the kind of place where nothing happens. That's the whole point of it. That's what people pay for. The discreet charm of the very comfortably well-off. And in one of those townhouses, behind those closed shutters, on a quiet street in a quiet city in a quiet country, one man very calmly executed his entire family with a hunting rifle, buried them beneath his own patio, sent a series of completely unhinged letters explaining his absence, drove south, checked into a budget hotel, walked out of it on foot, and vanished off the face of the earth. That was 15 years ago. He has not been seen since. This is the case of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because almost every single detail of this story, when you stop and actually think about it, falls into one of two categories. Either it's impossible, or it's an act of pure, breathtaking arrogance. So let's get into it. The Dupont de Ligonnès family were, on paper, French aristocracy. Real, actual minor nobility. The kind of family with a D in the name and a coat of arms somewhere, and a deep generations-old Catholicism that ran their entire social calendar. Xavier was the patriarch. He was 50 years old. He told everyone he was a businessman. In reality, his businesses were a mess, failing, drowning in hidden debt. But you would never have known because Xavier was a virtuoso of appearances. His wife, Agnès, was 49. Devout. Warm. She taught catechism at a local private Catholic school, the kind of mother other mothers respected. And they had 4 children. Arthur, the oldest, was 20. Thomas was 18, Anne was 16, and the youngest, Benoit, was 13. They had 2 yellow Labrador retrievers, Leon and Jules, who got walked at the same time every day by the same people on the same streets. Neighbors used the same word over and over to describe them, courteous and discreet. They went to mass, they went to school, they walked the dogs. They were, in every external way, the picture of stable upper-middle-class French Catholic life. What none of those neighbors knew was that Xavier, the man bowing politely on the sidewalk, had been quietly buying quicklime and hessian sacks and cement, and had been digging. Sometime in the first week of April 2011, investigators believe around the night of April 3rd into the 4th, Xavier moved through his own house and methodically ended the lives of his sleeping wife, 3 of his children, and the family pets. Then he waited. His second son, Thomas, was away. On April 5th, Thomas came home, and Xavier killed him too. He wrapped the bodies in hessian sacks. He carried them, one by one, down to a crawl space beneath the patio of the house, a low, cramped concrete space he had been excavating for weeks. He laid them out. He utilized heavy chemical measures to slow down the timeline of discovery. He poured fresh concrete over the top. He brushed off his clothes, and he walked back upstairs. Now stop. Just stop for a second. Because the first logic gap of this whole case is right here. This is a row of townhouses in a dense suburban neighborhood. Walls share with walls. Even a .22, a small caliber rifle, yes, but a rifle, makes noise. There are screams, there are bodies falling. There are 2 large Labradors barking. And not a single neighbor on Boulevard Robert Schumann reported a single unusual sound that whole week. How? How do you execute 5 people and 2 dogs in stages, in a townhouse with neighbors on either side, and have the street stay completely quiet? Either Xavier was unbelievably methodical, taking each victim somewhere insulated, doing it in their sleep with extreme care, timing things to coincide with street noise, or this whole crime happened in a kind of muffled bubble that defies any reasonable acoustics. Either way. By April 5th, the entire family was under the patio, and Xavier was alone in the house. This is where it goes from a horrific crime to something genuinely strange. Because instead of running, Xavier sat down at his desk, and he started writing. First, the practical lies. To his children's private Catholic school, a formal letter arrived enclosing a check for the rest of the year's tuition, explaining that the family was relocating to Australia due to an urgent professional transfer. A similar letter went to the school where Agnes worked, explaining her resignation. To the neighbors, a small typewritten note appeared taped to the family's letterbox. Please return all mail to sender. To Xavier's own brothers and sisters, and to 7 other close relatives, 9 recipients in total, a long, detailed letter arrived in the mail. It is now famously known as the Letter to 9. In this letter, Xavier explained that back in 2003, while running a company in Miami, he had been quietly recruited by the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. He had been working as a deep-cover American intelligence asset for years, infiltrating the French nightclub scene, monitoring money laundering and drug trafficking. And now, his cover had been blown. The American government was extracting his entire family into the United States, into a witness protection program. They couldn't be contacted, maybe for years. He even, brazenly, gave instructions in the letter on how to manage the family's finances in his absence. He casually mentioned that he had given his car to a friend for parts. He hadn't. He was about to drive it south. He noted that he had personally cleaned out his older son's university dorm rooms. Now look, if you just murdered your entire family and you need a few days of head start to disappear, what do you write? You write, "We had to leave suddenly for a family emergency overseas. Please don't worry, we'll be in touch." Something boring, something forgettable, something that buys you a week. You do not invent a wildly elaborate, completely insane story about the United States DEA and witness protection and nightclub espionage. Because a story like that doesn't buy you time. It does the opposite. It instantly raises every red flag in the family network. Well, within a week, somebody is going to call the police. Of course they are. So why did Xavier do it? The honest answer, and most criminologists agree on this, is that the letter was never really about escape. It was about ego. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès was a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in being somebody, an aristocrat, a man of substance, a man with a noble name. And what he could not bear, more than anything in the world, was the idea of being remembered as a bankrupt failure who killed his own children because he couldn't pay his bills. So he wrote himself a different ending. He cast himself in his own movie. He was not the fraud who buried his wife under a patio. He was the secret agent, the man with a mission, the James Bond of Nantes. That letter's not a cover story. It is a fantasy. It is the last performance of a narcissist before he steps off stage. On April 12th, Xavier got into his car and he drove south. And here's the second strangest part of this whole case. He didn't hide. He paid with his own credit cards. He used cash machines that recorded him. He stopped at restaurants. He checked into budget hotels and signed the registers. He stopped at gas stations under bright lights. He stared calmly into multiple CCTV cameras along the route. There is footage of him, clear footage, walking through hotel lobbies and gas station forecourts, looking like a man on a leisurely holiday. He drove all the way to the French Riviera, to the Var region in the south. He checked into a cheap hotel near La Tourbière. He spent the night. And then, on the morning of April 15th, 2011, he walked out of that hotel, on foot, with a duffel bag containing, investigators believe, a hunting rifle. He started walking inland, toward the mountains. That is the last verified sighting of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, anywhere, by anyone. Now, this is the third logic gap, and it is the biggest one. It's 2011, not 1911, not 1971. 2011. It's the era of mobile phones pinging cell towers automatically, credit card networks, facial recognition, Interpol databases, international border alerts, CCTV cameras everywhere. The world is not a place where a 50-year-old white French aristocrat can simply walk off into a sunset and never be seen again. And yet, that is exactly what he did. There are two real possibilities. One, he walked into a remote spot in the mountains, that hunting rifle in his bag, and he took his own life somewhere so isolated, in terrain so harsh, that his body has simply never been found. Possible. There's a lot of wilderness in the Mercantour and the surrounding ranges. A body in a ravine, hit by weather and animals, can disappear quickly. Two, and this is the theory his own sister Christine still insists on 15 years later, he didn't kill himself. He had help. He always had help. Maybe an accomplice picked him up. Maybe the whole walking into the mountains with a rifle routine was misdirection. Maybe Xavier was halfway to South America within a week. There have been sightings of him for over a decade now. Glasgow, South America, a monastery in southern France, a roadside in Eastern Europe. The most famous was in 2019, when French authorities triumphantly announced they had arrested him at an airport in Scotland, and then quietly had to walk it back when DNA proved the man they'd grabbed was an unrelated retiree. He has been spotted nowhere. He has been spotted everywhere, which, in a way, is the same thing as being spotted nowhere. So, this is where we are. April 2011. A man systematically murdered his own family in a quiet suburb in western France. He buried them beneath his own patio. He wrote a long, theatrical letter casting himself as a secret American spy. He drove south, calm as a man on vacation, smiling for the cameras. He walked into a hotel near the Riviera, slept one night, walked out the next morning, and stepped over an invisible line into the kind of non-existence that's not supposed to be possible anymore. The family was discovered later that month, when concerned neighbors finally got the police interested enough to come dig up the patio. And ever since, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès has been on Interpol's most wanted list, one of the most pursued fugitives in modern Europe, wanted in every country with a working passport scanner. And nothing. 15 years and counting. Nothing. A father of 4 wrapped his children in sacks, poured concrete over them, packed a bag, drove south through the spring sunshine, and walked out of his hotel one morning into the trees. And the trees just kept him. It's December 7th, 1958, a Sunday. The kind of crisp, sunlit winter morning where the air smells like pine and wood smoke, and the radio in your kitchen is playing Christmas songs. In a tidy little house in the Roseway neighborhood of Northeast Portland, Oregon, a family of 5 is loading up their cream and red 1954 Ford station wagon. They're going for a drive, up into the Columbia River Gorge, that breathtaking scar of basalt and waterfalls that cuts between Oregon and Washington. The plan is simple, pretty as a postcard. They're going to gather wild greenery, pine boughs, holly, that kind of thing, to make their own Christmas wreaths at home. They never came home. This is the Martin family. And for 66 years, their disappearance was one of the most baffling, theory-soaked, suspect-laden cold cases in Oregon's history. Bloody guns, ex-convicts, stolen cars, suspicious diner sightings, the whole works. Every detective who ever looked at this case was certain that the Martins met with foul play, and every single one of them was wrong. So let's get into it, because the way this case finally resolved last year is in some ways more haunting than the conspiracy theories ever were. Kenneth Martin was 54 years old, worked at a place called Eccles Electric Home Service. Solid guy, reliable. The kind of man whose boss noticed the second he didn't show up to work. His wife Barbara was 48. She'd been a Rose Festival junior queen back in her youth, which gives you a sense of who she was, the local girl-made-good archetype. They had 3 daughters at home. Barbie, the oldest, was 14. Virginia, the middle one, was 13. And the youngest, Susan, was 11. Their older son, Donald, was off serving in the U.S. Navy. In their Roseway neighborhood, the Martins were beloved. Every Christmas, they dressed up as Santa Claus and turned their block into something the local kids called Candy Lane. That's the kind of family we're talking about. Wholesome, engaged, the bedrock of their community. There was no debt, no marital trouble, no mental illness, no secret enemies, no criminal entanglements. This was a 1950s suburban family in the purest, most unironic sense, which is part of what made what happened next so completely impossible to make sense of. The Martins headed east out of Portland on the morning of December 7th into the Columbia River Gorge. Around 4 p.m., they stopped at a gas station in Cascade Locks, where the proprietor, a guy named Dean Baxter, sold them gas and chatted with them. They were in good spirits, normal, just a family on a day trip. Then, a little while later, maybe 20 miles further east, they pulled into a place called the Paradise Snack Bar in Hood River. Late lunch, early dinner, whatever you want to call it, a waitress served them. The girls had their meals. The family was, again, completely unremarkable, happy, together. That was the last time anybody saw them alive. By dusk, motorists reported spotting a station wagon matching theirs across the river on the Washington side. After that, silence. Monday morning rolls around. Kenneth doesn't show up at Eccles Electric. The girls aren't at school. By the time anyone got worried enough to drive over to the Roseway house, that house was sitting there frozen in time. Breakfast dishes in the sink, a load of laundry wet in the washing machine. Bank accounts full and untouched, closets full of clothes, no suitcase taken, no goodbye note, nothing. A family of 5 in a 1954 Ford station wagon had simply driven into the Columbia River Gorge and vanished. Now, here's where the case got weird. Because the gorge, on that exact same weekend, was crawling with criminal activity that seemed tailor-made to be connected to the Martins. The day after the family vanished, 2 ex-convicts were arrested for stealing a white 1951 Chevrolet. One of them was a guy named Roy Light. The stolen Chevy turned up abandoned in Cascade Locks, the same town where Kenneth had bought gas the previous afternoon. And near that abandoned stolen car, police found 2 things that made every detective in Oregon sit up straight. The first was a woman's glove, a glove that looked an awful lot like the kind of glove Barbara Martin would wear. The second was a .38 caliber Colt Commander handgun covered in dried blood. Stop. Let that sink in. A bloody handgun. Near an abandoned stolen car. In the exact town where a family of 5 had just vanished without a trace. It gets weirder. When investigators traced where that .38 had come from, the trail led them to a Meyer and Frank department store in Portland, which would be a fun coincidence on its own, except for one detail. Meyer and Frank was the exact store where the Martins' Navy son Donald had previously been employed, and where he had reportedly been accused of stealing some sporting goods at some point. Different department, same store. But somehow the bloody gun in the gorge had a tenuous 6 degrees of separation link back to the Martin family. And then, a waiter from the Paradise Snack Bar, the same diner where the Martins ate their last meal, came forward and told police something. He said that on that Sunday afternoon, while the Martins were eating, 2 other men were eating in the same diner. And he said both parties had left the diner at roughly the same time. You can picture every detective in 1958 leaning forward in their chair when they heard that. Ex-convicts, a stolen car, a bloody gun, a glove, a diner sighting, a family of 5 gone. For decades, this was the working theory. The Martins ran into the wrong people in those mountains. Maybe they were forced off the road. Maybe they were robbed. Maybe they were killed and dumped in the river, and the gun and glove were a trail of breadcrumbs the criminals were too sloppy to clean up. It seemed obvious. It seemed inevitable. And so, for 66 years, that's where the case sat, in limbo. Bodies of 2 of the daughters, Susan and Virginia, washed up downstream in May of 1959. But Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie? Nothing. No trace. Here's where I have to stop the standard Mystery Channel narrative and just be honest with you. Because that whole foul play theory? It was wrong. Every bit of it. In late 2024, an independent diver named Archer Mayo, a guy who hunts for old lost vehicles in the Columbia River as a kind of obsessive personal project, was scanning a deep underwater pit near Cascade Locks. And he found something. 50 feet down, a car upside down, sitting on the riverbed in the freezing dark where it had been sitting since 1958, a 1954 Ford station wagon. In 2025, he recovered human remains and a camera cover from inside the wreck. The camera cover had Kenneth Martin's name on it. In April of 2026, just last month as we sit here, a lab called Othram, in partnership with the Oregon State Medical Examiner, used forensic DNA sequencing to positively identify the remains of Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie Martin. After 66 years, the entire family was finally accounted for. And the Hood River County Sheriff's Office, after looking at all of it, came to a conclusion. There was no evidence of a crime. The car had not been pushed. There was no second vehicle involved. There was no bullet in anyone. There was no struggle. What had probably happened was this. As the sun set over the Cascade Locks area on December 7, 1958, Kenneth Martin, a man in unfamiliar territory in a heavy car with 1950s headlights and 1950s brakes, misjudged the edge of a road or a parking area near the river. The car went over, it went in upside down. The water was freezing, doors and windows were probably already starting to leak, and a heavy station wagon sinks fast. 2 of the daughters washed out of the wreck and were found downstream months later. 3 members of the family remained trapped inside the car as it settled into a deep underwater pit where the current couldn't reach it, and where no search rig in 1958 or 1959 or any year after had the technology to find it. 66 years, 50 feet of water, that was the whole mystery. So here's the question I want to leave you with, because this is the genuinely uncomfortable part. If the Martins were the victims of a tragic, completely accidental drive-off into the river, how did every single piece of peripheral evidence in this case scream foul play for over 6 decades? Think about it. 2 ex-convicts happened to be eating in the same diner. Pure coincidence. A stolen Chevy happened to be abandoned in the same small town. Unrelated, a bloody .38 caliber handgun happened to be found in the brush nearby. Completely unconnected to the Martins. And that bloody gun happened to be traceable back to the same department store where the Martins' son had once worked. None of it. None of it was real evidence. All of it was noise. The universe's idea of a cruel joke, a constellation of statistically unlikely coincidences, all clustering in the same 48-hour window, in the same small geographic area, around the same family, and pointing investigators in exactly the wrong direction for 6.5 decades. If a writer put that string of coincidences in a novel, an editor would cross it out and write "too implausible" in the margin. And yet, that's what happened. Real life served up a perfect murder mystery, complete with shady suspects and a bloody weapon, around a tragedy that was, in the end, just an accident. That's the real logic gap of this case. Not, why doesn't the murder theory make sense, but how does the universe manufacture this much misdirection around something that turns out to be so simple? So here's where we end up. On a December afternoon in 1958, a wholesome American family went looking for Christmas branches in one of the most beautiful places on earth. They ate one last meal at a diner, somewhere east of Portland. They got back in their cream and red station wagon, and somewhere in the fading winter light, on a road they probably didn't know well, Kenneth Martin made one small mistake. And the Columbia River, cold, indifferent, deep beyond imagining, closed over them. For 2/3 of a century, they sat down there. Susan and Virginia drifted free. The other three didn't. The river held them. The detectives chased ghosts. The world built up a story around two ex-cons and a bloody handgun. And down in that black pit, 50 feet beneath the surface, the answer just waited. It took one stubborn diver with a sonar rig and a private mission to do what hundreds of searchers in 1958 couldn't do. In April of last year, Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie Martin came home. A family went looking for Christmas cheer in the Oregon wilderness. They never found it. And the river, finally, after 66 winters, gave them back. Picture West London, February 2003. Heston, specifically. It's a busy, affluent corner of the capital, just inside the M25, the kind of suburb where the houses have driveways big enough for 2 cars and a van, where the high streets smell like Indian sweets and curry leaves, where successful immigrant families have built lives that look, from the outside, exactly like the British dream is supposed to look. In one of those houses lived the Chauhan family, a young wife, 2 infant sons, the grandmother visiting from India. And at the head of it all, a self-made millionaire named Amarjit Chauhan, who had built a freight empire from absolutely nothing. And one February day, all 5 of them, 3 generations of a single bloodline, vanished from that house at the same time. When the case finally cracked open 2 months later, the truth was so cold, so coldly logistical, that even hardened British detectives reportedly had trouble keeping their composure. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a domestic killing. This was an entire family liquidated methodically over the course of 3 days by a small group of men who wanted his trucks. This is the Chauhan family case, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because the only reason any of us are talking about it today, the only reason these murderers are not currently free men, is because of one folded piece of paper hidden in one place that the killers never thought to check. So let's get into it. Amarjit Chauhan, known to most people as Anil, was 45 years old in early 2003. Born in India, came to Britain, built a life from scratch. By the time we're picking up the story, he ran a company called CIBA Freight Services out of Southall. Big operation, 30 employees, annual turnover somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million pounds, international shipping, real, legitimate, lucrative work. His wife Nancy was 24. They had 2 tiny boys, Devender, 18 months old, still in nappies, just learning to walk, and Ravinder, 8 weeks old. 8 weeks, a newborn. And visiting from India to help with the new baby was Nancy's mother, Charanjit Kaur, 51 years old, devout Sikh woman. Brought her holy book with her, the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the central scripture of Sikhism. For a practicing Sikh, that book is not luggage. It is sacred. It does not get abandoned ever under any circumstances. So that's the household. 5 people, 3 generations, spanning newborn to grandmother, living in a comfortable, busy home in West London. There is one wrinkle in the picture, and it matters. Back in the late 1990s, Amarjit had served an 18-month prison sentence for tax evasion. While he was inside, he allegedly crossed paths with a fellow inmate named Kenneth Reagan, a convicted drug dealer with expensive tastes who had once lived a lavish lifestyle in Monaco and lost it all when he went to prison. Reagan, sitting in his cell, looked at this immigrant businessman, took note of the shipping company waiting for him on the outside, and started thinking. By 2003, Kenneth Reagan was out of prison, and he had decided that he wanted CIBA Freight, not to buy it, not to invest in it, to take it, because a real working freight company with real customs paperwork and real international routes is the single most valuable thing a drug smuggler can possibly own. He wasn't trying to be Amarjeet's partner. He was trying to be his replacement. In early February 2003, Amarjeet clearly sensed that something terrible was coming. On the 12th, in a small act that would eventually crack the entire case wide open, he sat down, wrote a folded note that named Kenneth Reagan, and tucked it inside his own sock. Inside his sock. Where, presumably, only a coroner would find it. Think about what that says. This is a man who believed, with real conviction, that the next time anybody saw him, he would be a corpse. On February 13th, Amarjeet was lured to a business meeting near Stonehenge. He'd been told he was going to meet some Dutch buyers. He drove out there. Instead, he was grabbed by Reagan and his crew, bound, drugged, held captive. Over the next 2 days, they subjected him to unimaginable duress. They forced him to sign over the ownership of CIBA Freight. They forced him to record an audio message intended to placate his wife. And then, somewhere in those 48 hours, they killed him. On the 14th, the gang moved on Nancy Charanjit and the 2 baby boys at the family home in Heston. They abducted all 4 of them. By February 15th, the entire Chauhan family, Amarjeet, Nancy, Charanjit, Devender, and 8-week-old Ravinder, were dead. Now, stop. Just sit with that scale for a second. 3 generations, 5 human beings, including an infant, wiped out in essentially 3 days, by a group of men whose actual goal was a corporate takeover. The killers thought they were being clever. They really did. To cover up the disappearance, they sent a typed letter to CIBA Freight, postmarked from Calais in France. The letter was supposedly from Amarjeet, claiming the family had suddenly fled the UK because of mounting business problems and a fear of fraud investigation. "We've gone away," the letter essentially said. "Don't look for us." For a moment, this nearly worked. The Metropolitan Police initially treated it as a possible voluntary disappearance. But here's the thing, Amarjeet Chauhan didn't type letters. Anyone who knew him knew that. He wrote by hand. He had a distinctive handwriting that everybody who did business with him recognized. A typed letter from Amarjeet Chauhan was, to anyone who actually knew the man, immediately wrong. Like a forgery so obvious you wonder how anyone tried it. And then there was the slightly bigger problem with the family's voluntary flight. The Home Office had their passports, all 5 of them. The whole family's travel documents were sitting at that exact moment in the possession of the UK government as part of an immigration matter. Amarjeet, his wife, his mother-in-law, and the 2 boys could not have crossed an international border on February 13th if they had wanted to. Not one of them. The Calais postmark wasn't a clue. It was somebody else putting a letter in a French post box. Then, Nancy's brother, a man named Onkar Verma, living in New Zealand, couldn't reach his sister. He raised the alarm. The police went into the house in Heston, and the house told the truth. Inside, the place was caught mid-life. Wet laundry was still sitting in the washing machine. Toys were scattered across the floor where the toddler had been playing. Baby things, bottles, blankets, were exactly where they had been left. And Charanjit's Guru Granth Sahib was still in the house. That book, that sacred book, the one a devout Sikh woman absolutely would never voluntarily leave behind, certainly not when traveling internationally. The presence of that book in the empty house screamed at anyone who understood what they were looking at, that Charanjit Kaur had not gone anywhere of her own free will. This was not a family that had fled. This was a family that had been extracted. Now, here's the part where the killers really lost the plot, because they had a body disposal problem, 5 of them to be specific. What they did was, frankly, panicked. They drove all 5 bodies down to a farm called Great Colford House in Studley, Devon, a property owned by an acquaintance of Reagan's, and they buried them in a drainage ditch in the wet Devon clay. Then, weeks later, they started feeling the heat of the police investigation. So in April, around Easter, they went back. They dug the bodies up, loaded the remains onto a boat, drove the boat out into the English Channel, off the coast near Poole, Dorset, and dumped them. That is not the work of professionals. That is the work of men who massively underestimated how hard it is to make 5 human beings disappear, and who kept doubling down on increasingly chaotic ideas. On April 22, 2003, a canoeist in the water near Bournemouth Pier spotted a body floating in the channel. It was Amarjeet. Days later, Nancy's body was recovered in the same general area. Later that summer, in July, Charanjit washed ashore near the Isle of Wight. And in the routine autopsy on Amarjeet's body, the pathologist, going through his clothes, slowly and carefully, found the note, folded, hidden, inside his sock, after more than 2 months in a wet field, after exhumation, after weeks at sea in the corrosive salt water of the English Channel. That note named Kenneth Regan, by name. The case essentially solved itself from that moment. Regan and his accomplices, William Hornsey and Peter Rees, were eventually convicted, and the trial became the longest in Metropolitan Police history. All 3 of them got life sentences. Let's actually pull this apart, because even with a conviction in the bag, the how of this case still has logic gaps that genuinely bother me. First, the alibi letter. Think about what the killers were asking the world to believe, that a 45-year-old businessman, panicking about tax problems, decided to flee to mainland Europe and decided to bring his entire household with him, his 24-year-old wife, his mother-in-law, a toddler, a 2-month-old baby. That is not how fugitives travel. Fugitives travel light. A man on the run does not pack his mother-in-law. He certainly does not pack a newborn. The whole point of running is to move quietly. A baby is a public address system in your arms. The letter was supposed to buy the killer's time. Instead, the second anyone with even a passing knowledge of the Chauhan family read it, every alarm bell rang at once. It didn't buy a single day. Second, the overkill. This is where Reagan's whole operation falls apart, criminologically. If your goal is to seize CIBA freight, you grab the owner, you torture him, you force him to sign over the company, you kill him. That's it. One body, one disappearance. But Reagan went after the whole household, the wife, who didn't run the business, the grandmother, who was just visiting from India and had nothing to do with anything, the toddler, the newborn. Why? Probably because Amarjeet, in the final negotiation of his life, would have refused to sign the company over unless the family was also taken under their control, a promise the killers were never going to honor. So Reagan and his crew brought the whole family in to keep Amarjeet cooperative through the torture. And then, once Amarjeet signed and was killed, the others were witnesses. The others had seen Reagan, the others had to go too. What started as a hostile corporate takeover ended as a multi-generational extermination, because 3 men in a panic decided that loose ends couldn't be left. Third, and this is the darkest thread of the entire case, the bodies. The adults all eventually washed ashore. Amarjeet, Nancy, Charanjit, 3 out of 5. The 2 babies never did. Devender, 18 months old. Ravender, 8 weeks old. To this day, the bodies of those 2 boys have never been recovered. The killers were eventually convicted of their murders, but they have never given a clear, credible account of what they did with the babies. There are dark theories about what that means. The most charitable, that the tiny bodies were dropped into the channel along with the adults, and that the current simply took them where larger bodies couldn't go. The least charitable, that the babies were disposed of separately somewhere else. The killers have never said. There is a small, terrible silence in the file where those 2 children should be. So this is where it ends. A man named Amarjeet Chauhan came to Britain with nothing, built a freight empire with his own 2 hands, and the very success of that empire is what made his family worth killing. A drug dealer with a Monaco habit and an English prison record decided he wanted those trucks, and over the course of 3 days in February 2003, he and 2 other men erased an entire family tree to get them. What saved this case was a single folded piece of paper tucked into a sock by a man who knew in his last days that the people across the table from him were going to murder him. That note survived torture, survived burial in a Devon field, survived exhumation, survived weeks in the English Channel, and it pointed straight at Kenneth Regan. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. 3 men are still serving life sentences for what they did to the Chauhans, but Devender and Ravender are still out there somewhere, and they probably always will be. 2 small boys who were brought into this world to be the future of a family, and who instead became the loose ends of a corporate takeover. A man built an empire to give his family the world, And the world, in the form of a man across a prison cell years earlier, looked at that empire and decided that the family was simply in the way. The English Channel gave back 3 of them. It kept the babies.